The death room of King George III. King George III, who reigned over Great Britain from 1760 until his death in 1820, was the longest-serving monarch in British history at the time. His reign spanned a period of significant political and social upheaval, including the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and numerous shifts in British domestic policy. However, the latter part of his reign was marred by an increasingly severe mental illness that affected his ability to rule effectively. George III's mental health issues had been a matter of public and royal concern for years, and by 1811 he had been rendered unable to perform his duties as monarch. His son, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, was appointed as regent under the Regency Act to govern in his stead. Despite these political adjustments, George III continued to live until 1820, when his long life came to an end. The place of George III's death is significant, not only because it marked the end of his reign, but also because it was a place associated with his physical and mental decline over the final years of his life. King George III, who had ruled Great Britain and Ireland for over 6 decades, spent his final years at Windsor Castle, a royal residence that had long been associated with the monarchy's privacy and retreat. It was here, on January 29, 1820, that he passed away after a long and debilitating illness. The room where George III died was located in the east wing of Windsor Castle, specifically within the Queen's private apartments, a part of the castle that, though part of the royal quarters, was typically used for more personal and family-centred occasions. Windsor Castle has served as one of the principal residences of the British monarchs for over 1,000 years. It is situated in the town of Windsor in Berkshire, and has been central to the British royal family's life since. Its construction by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. Over the centuries, the castle has expanded and evolved, accommodating the changing needs of the monarchy. By the time of King George III's reign, Windsor Castle had become a symbol of royal authority, but also of retreat. The king had a deep affection for the castle, which offered him a serene environment away from the bustle of court life in London. However, by the early 19th century, the royal residence had become more than just a place of rest for George III. It had turned into a sanctuary, a place where he could live more privately due to his declining mental health. When George's mental illness worsened, particularly from 1810 onward, he withdrew from the public eye, and Windsor Castle became his primary residence. The king, who had once been active and involved in the affairs of state, now required the constant care of his physicians and his family, who all kept a close watch on his condition. His life in these final years was marked by isolation and a gradual decline. While some of his family members came to visit, George III's royal apartments at Windsor were a sombre and quiet place, much more modest compared to grand state rooms of his earlier reign. George III's death took place in the Queen's private apartments on the upper floors of the east wing of Windsor Castle. The east wing, while not as publicly used as the main parts of the castle, was still part of the royal complex. These rooms were generally reserved for the king and queen's private lives. They offered seclusion from the more official areas of the palace, which was increasingly important as George's mental health deteriorated. The room where George III died was likely his bedroom, although some accounts do suggest that he passed away in the adjoining sitting room or withdrawing room. These rooms were part of a suite that included a private audience room, where the king could meet with select members of his family or his physicians. Over time, these rooms became less about state matters and more about the king's personal care. The rooms themselves were likely quite simple and functional, more focused on comfort than splendour, and reflecting the difficult and tragic nature of George III's later life. The furniture in his bedroom was described as modest, far removed from the lavish surroundings that had once defined royal living. There were likely simple chairs, a small writing desk, and perhaps a bedside table where he could keep his personal effects, but nothing extravagant. The room was subdued in its decoration, with muted tones on the walls and simple furnishings. Emphasis here was on quiet privacy, offering the king a serene place to spend his final days, away from the public eye. The room itself was not ornate, but conveyed a sense of melancholy. It was filled with light from the large windows overlooking the grounds of Windsor Castle, but those windows were shut during the final days of the king's life, either to maintain his privacy or because of his sensitivity to light, which was a known symptom of his illness. The room would have felt like both a retreat and a tomb, a place where the king was kept isolated, but also cared for until his death. The location of these private apartments in the East Wing meant that they were not immediately part of the more frequently visited areas of Windsor Castle, such as the Grand State Apartments or the St. George's Chapel. The king's death then occurred far from the pomp and ceremony of the royal court, in a room removed from the royal functions that would have once surrounded him. His bedroom and adjoining spaces were where he spent the final days of his life, surrounded by those that were closest to him, including his physicians and family members. In the days leading up to George III's death, the atmosphere in his room at Windsor Castle would have been sombre and quiet. The king's mental health had been in decline for years, and by 1820 he was a shadow of the man that he had once been. Although George III had been cared for by a succession of royal physicians, his condition did not improve, and by the time of his death he had become severely debilitated, often unable to recognize family members and struggling to engage with his surroundings. His final days were marked by increasing frailty, and the room where he died would have been filled with the sounds of the quiet, soft-spoken attendants tending to him, and the king himself, often barely coherent, lying in bed. His family, particularly the Prince Regent, later George IV, may have visited briefly, though by then their relationship had become strained. The room's simplicity would have reflected the isolation that George experienced in his final years. In the hours before his death, King George III's breathing became laboured. His physicians were unable to offer any further treatment. Those in the room may have realised that the end was near, and the atmosphere would have been shifted to one of mournful anticipation. Finally, George III passed away, quietly and with little ceremony, on the morning of the 29th of January, 1820. The room where George III died, while it might not have been of great historical significance at the time, is now a poignant symbol of the tragic end of a monarch whose reign had witnessed both remarkable achievements and profound personal struggles. Today, Windsor Castle remains one of the most important royal residences in the United Kingdom, and although the specific details of the room have changed somewhat over time, it still evokes a sense of quiet reverence for the king's final moments. Visitors to Windsor Castle may not enter the precise room where George III died, as other royal apartments and personal spaces are often kept private. However, the east wing of the castle, which houses the Queen's private apartments, remains a key part of the royal tour. The rooms have undergone renovations over the years, but the legacy of George III's final days still resonates within the halls of Windsor Castle. For those with an interest in royal history, the room serves as a reminder of the personal toll that illness can take on a monarch. King George III, once a strong and vibrant king, became a figure of great tragedy in the eyes of its contemporaries, and the room where he passed away represents the end of an era for both him and the British monarchy. King George III's death in Windsor Castle marked the end of a long and difficult period in the life of Britain's monarch. The room in which he passed away was a simple private space, far removed from the grandeur and ceremony that had once defined his reign. It stood as a quiet, sombre testament to a monarch who had once ruled a vast empire, but whose final years were overshadowed by personal tragedy. The room, though now part of history, remains a poignant reminder of the life and death of a king whose legacy is shaped by both his achievements and his struggles.